Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. I'm going to model that right now. In fact, it was not on silent. My name is Salvatore Scabone. I'm the Weinberg Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library. Some of you may know the Cullman Center appoints 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive a stipend, an office in the center, and enhanced access to our collections so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and this series of conversations presents the books that our fellows came here to write. Sometimes long after they were fellows, but we stick with them and want to celebrate the books whenever they come to fruition. We believe their books will make important contributions to scholarship and literature, and that they will last. Tonight we help launch Maile Chapman's new novel, The Spoil, which the novelist Alyssa Nutting calls a shimmering, holographic, cerebral desert thriller of extremity, equal parts heartbreaking and terrifying. Maile Chapman will discuss her book with New Yorker staff writer and past Cullman Center fellow Larissa MacFarquhar. After about 35 or 40 minutes of discussion, our presenters will move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose one, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will pass along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. Copies of the book are for sale in the hall, and Maile has generously agreed to sign your copy if you like. Tonight's interlocutor, Larissa MacFarquhar, is the author of Strangers Drowning, Impossible Idealism, Drastic Choices, and the Urge to Help. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker and was the Dorothy Cullman Fellow at the Cullman Center in 2010-2011. During the same year, Maile Chapman was also a fellow, and she's the author of Your Presence is Requested at Suvanto, a novel that was the finalist for the Guardian First Book Award and the Penn Center USA Literary Award. She teaches in the English and Creative Writing International program at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. As I said, she worked on The Spoil during her Cullman Center Fellowship 15 years ago. In 2010-2011, we're proud to welcome them both back to the Cullman Center to celebrate this long-awaited book.
Thank you, Salvatore, and thank you all for coming. I want to start by asking Maile to read you a passage from her book because, we can talk about the themes of the book and some of the things it evokes, directions it leads in, but something that I don't think we'll be able to fully convey except by this means is the quality of the sentences, which are so beautiful, and the story is extremely absorbing, and so sometimes you'll just be drawn along by that, and then every now and again you will awaken again to the extraordinary quality of the language that you're reading, and so I wanted to give you a taste of that.
Thank you. I'm just going to read from the beginning, chapter 1, beginning of the novel. The main character's name is Mandy, but this is really the introduction to the world. Chapter 1. I was reading by the wood stove when I heard my grandmother lift the phone to answer a call almost before it rang. She spoke briefly, inaudibly, so as not to wake my grandfather after his swing shift at the mill. When she replaced the phone softly in its cradle, I turned my eyes back down to the open page of my book of Greek mythology. Night was the child of chaos, and so was Erebus. In the whole universe, there was nothing else. All was black, empty, silent, endless. Until she touched my shoulder to hand me a bowl of warm applesauce and say that Jandine, my mother, wanted to stay with Terry a little longer. She said this like I already knew all about Terry. To be fair, Jandine probably did tell me. Eventually, I would have an extra hearing test at school, but my ears were not the issue. After lunch, I closed the back door quietly on my way outside and then sat on the steps to pull my rubber boots on, even though Jandine said sitting on cold cement was an invitation to hemorrhoids, but she wasn't there, so I did it anyway. The grass in the yard was heavy and wet, and I took a shortcut through the garden, over the path between pumpkin runners and corn stalks, toward the line of trees in the distance. In the boundary field, I thought I could hear something under the tasseling slap of longer grass against my boots. But when I stopped to listen, there was only the sycamore trees of the windbreak ahead and the evergreens on either side shivering. I picked my way through the reeds and cattails growing along the ditch, where I felt the shock of cold, even through double socks and boots half a size too large. This was the property line and a sign to turn back. But you know what they say, children feel what they haven't been told. And it was the 70s, everything bright but out of focus, as if seen through a haze of goldenrod. I knew to be careful outside anytime I went looking for berries or bottles or owl pellets in the ruins left by old Dutch farmers who retired or died before us in the outbuildings left to fall down slowly in the fields, like the empty brooder house or the old barn, stained with rusty nails in boards turning silver in the weather, where Jandine said I didn't want to be when the roof fell in. But the empty house behind the sycamores seemed different, the house where Mrs. Field had lived, with a dish of peppermints on a table and a rotary phone on the wall and a wooden front door hidden inside a shady screened porch. She had sometimes propped that door open with a bucket of river stones. I thought I could remember seeing her there at the doorway, lifting the bucket by the handle, though maybe this was just something I'd heard about later in passing, when she still occasionally came up in conversation. I thought I'd get to speak to Jandine when she called. Earlier in the day, I had lifted the phone to see if the neighbors were monopolizing the party line, just in case Jandine was calling and couldn't get through, but when the call did come, it was so brief that I'd missed it. Mrs. Field's front yard was nearly gone in the uncut grass, her hedges overgrown, smelling of ammonia, and there were 2 brindled barn cats lying on her slanted cellar doors, flat and dead in the afternoon sunlight. I stopped short, but they were up and streaking away in the same instant. From across the field, this house had looked as warm as a butternut squash, half hidden and glowing at sunset, but up close the paint was cracking away from the wood. And there was a metallic smell coming from a cast iron bathtub by the front steps, pulled out of the house and left there by someone who meant to be helpful, since everybody knows bathtubs aren't safe for older people who live alone. I climbed the front step to look in through the storm door at an enclosed porch, long and narrow, set up like a galley kitchen with a utility sink, a stove, and a compact refrigerator. Just inside sat the bucket filled with stones, blue-gray, veined with quartz, and smooth. When I opened the door, the cylinder overhead wheezed, and after I stepped over the threshold, it shut itself slowly behind me. The air inside was motionless and smelled of stale broiler pans. The front door proper was locked, but behind a wavy glass window, I could make out the shape of an armchair with blue and black upholstery. I probably did remember Mrs. Field sitting in that chair, sitting in that room, maybe wearing a dark, plain dress and getting slowly up to answer when we knocked. My grandmother and Jandine and I had been standing outside on the cement steps, looking in through the storm door. "Knock louder," my grandmother had said. "She doesn't hear well." I had been holding some small gift for her, berries probably, in a bowl lined with waxed paper. What I could see of the living room now was dim and indistinct, with a pale shape at the far wall about the size and shape of the rotary telephone in my memory. Long disconnected, though this hadn't occurred to me until I was standing there looking for it. A breeze shimmered through the trees outside, and the sheets of plastic nailed over the porch windows rustled, startling me. And when I turned, I could see that the appliances had been pulled away from the shingled house wall, so that each rested on one of the support beams visible now as a grid under the linoleum, holding up the drooping floor of the porch. I took a step backward without thinking, and my foot split the vinyl and rotten plywood, dropping like a lead weight through damp newspaper. And I was lucky. I'd been standing on a beam without knowing, and it caught me and kept me from falling all the way through. My leg was pinned at mid-thigh in the rotten floor, my foot dangling out of sight in the root cellar under the house, already numb in the cold. Unless it was numb because I'd hurt myself too badly to know it yet. by impaling my foot on a rusty wire or cutting myself on old glass or 100 other awful things that I'd been warned to avoid. I gave my leg a careful shake to bring the feeling back to make sure I hadn't gotten snagged on anything down there before trying to pull my leg free. But when I did, my foot grazed something. I moved my foot again, more slowly this time, and again I felt something there. It was a hand cupping the heel of my boot, and then another hand closing around my ankle to get a firmer hold through the smooth rubber of my boot. It wouldn't take much, I knew, to yank me down. I could smell the rot from the floor, and I was breathless and lightheaded, and I couldn't get a good grip on anything until suddenly I did somehow, and then freed my leg, and I hit the storm door, which burst open, and then I was out of the house, but my leg felt unfamiliar and nerveless and too weak to fully hold my weight. I heard the bucket inside tipping over, a strange, slow sound, and the river stones spilling out and falling through the rotten floor, and then shattering in the cellar below. And then I was up and scattering away like the feral brindled cats, running through the field, the ground jolting under a foot I couldn't feel in the ditch, until in the ditch I felt my bare skin being cut by the broken reeds, my boot and sock pulled off and left behind under Mrs. Field's house. That's chapter 1.
So now you see what I mean. I was talking to Maile earlier about how she sort of started this book at the Cullman Center when we were there together in 2010, but it went on a sort of long journey, and I was wondering if you could describe the origin of it and how this particular book, as it took final form, how it took shape.
Originally, this was the side project that I was working on because it was lighter than the one that I had come to work on. And it was more about, it sort of revolved around the question of what to do with a relative's classic car, maybe after that relative passes away, a big car. I had an uncle who gave me a 1964 Buick Skylark convertible once that was an amazing car to drive. Maybe not great in the state of Washington because it leaked. And I was in college, and at one point I had grass growing in the carpet in the back, which was not ideal. But it's huge. It was so big that I think he had a twin mattress in the trunk that he could sleep in. It was a massive car. And what does one do with something that you can't drive every day, that's too sentimental to part with, and that meant a great deal to somebody? That was how it started, and I was writing about Las Vegas, which is kind of hard to write about when you're there, and easier. I've heard from plenty of people. It's easier, like any place. It's easier to write about when you're not there. So I was writing that about Vegas a little bit on the side, and it grew to be this when I, for various reasons, kind of set aside the other project for a while.
Well, I mean, I was going to start somewhere else, but now that you described that origin, one of the extraordinary things about this book is the unbelievably vivid and precise way she describes the physical texture of everyday life, like the enormous number of objects that come together to form the shell that we live in, and how they all interact with each other, and then after how when someone dies, you have these enormous numbers of objects, and how a caring and careful and sentimental person finds it very, very difficult to deal with all this stuff. I wonder if you could talk. There was this passage that I wanted to read. Of course, people have different attitudes towards physical stuff. Some people don't care about it at all, and some people care about it very, very much. And I'll read just a quick passage from the book to give you a sense of how she describes this. I'm sure Jeff has no memory now of having stood on the uneven paving stones displaced by the roots of trees in the backyard after his father died. No memory of pointing to where they hung above the filthy insulated doghouses used by cats and raccoons, stuffed with ruined thermal beds and heating pads dangerously soaked with piss and rain, strung on a grid of aged outdoor extension cords. He doesn't remember saying, "Toss everything." I had already shut off the breaker before touching everything after I found a heating pad in Terry's outdoor chair tucked between the rain-soaked cushions. He could, in theory, have been electrocuted, but I know what Terry was thinking. He was looking at the old yard cats and providing warmth in the grim damp for their little light bones in his own lumbar trouble. Jeff does not remember that he pointed at Terry's AM/FM radio, the pewter ashtray full of cigar butts, the 2 barbecues, 1 gas, 1 old school with a bag of melting charcoal inside, the rusty tongs and scrapers, the thermometer shaped like a pine cone, and the plastic rain gauge we gave him for Father's Day ages ago. He doesn't remember saying, "There's nothing to salvage. Call the junk people. Get it over with." I wonder if you could talk about how, and you see what I mean, like the all these objects that most people don't even notice are described with such electric vividness in this book, and it really changes the way you look at the world once you've read it and can see things through Maile's eyes. I wonder if you could talk about your relationship to these things other than that Buick Skylark, which was complicated evidently, and how that became such a big part of the texture of this book.
One thing I found when I was writing that it, in a strange way, similar to like insurance matters, that the sheer volume of things to manage quickly gets very tedious to read about or to write about. And so part of the challenge was how to write about it without it all just sort of mushing out into a big grayscale of meaningless clutter, as in life. That's the challenge, to have that not happen either in fiction or in life. And that took a long time for me to try to figure out the balance of that, how to write about some things and make it feel like more things, how to populate the house. This is a roundabout answer. I spend a fair amount of time handling things in thrift stores, in antique malls, at yard sales, and it's meditative for me. It engages the sort of kind of front-looking part with something that's interesting, not difficult. It's engaging, but kind of like walking or knitting or whatever other sort of, mildly repetitive thing. And I find that helped me a lot through the writing process, is going to thrift stores, going to secondhand shops, and occasionally finding things, even things where it's not clear what it was, or if it's part of something. But it's engaging, and some things you can feel that they have a purpose. They have this sense that it's for something, not always clear what. I also occasionally go to estate sales, especially after having had family members whose things were, some of their things were dispersed into the world through estate sales, because it felt less gloomy, or less only gloomy to me, because the things need to be dispersed for the family and for the person. And it's very complicated. No two situations are alike. So I have a lot of sort of feelings about the charge that things carry and the meaning that they carry during a life, and then the different meaning that they carry maybe after the person whose thing it was, or who really cared about it, or who made it, or even who had it for a minute after they're not there. The context is sort of abbreviated for the next person who comes across it. But sometimes you can feel that there's something to it. And sometimes a thing is just a thing. It's impossible to know. So that was part of why I wanted to write about things, just the interest that I have in them as part of the writing process, but then also from a family perspective, and having been on both sides of that.
I mean, that's something we also talked about earlier. I mean, a central part of this book, in the middle of the story, between a section about the protagonist's childhood, part of which you heard Maile read, and then her later adulthood, is a period of caregiving for her mother, who has dementia, and then grieving her once she's gone. And I was wondering if you could describe like what you wanted to. I mean, we talked a bit about this. Like, caregiving is such a fraught and emotional and in a way, hellish topic. And I was wondering what you wanted to describe and convey about it in the way you treat it in this book.
I really wanted to preserve something positive and beautiful, and to not write about a character with cognitive illness and the family members, and the protagonist in the novel is the daughter of someone with cognitive illness. I wanted it not to be only, this is going to sound really weird and like a really hard sell, but not to only be the sad and terrible one-directional experience, because there is so much more to it than that. And my sister and I were able to spend a lot of time with our mother when she was sick. Not everybody gets that opportunity, and it was not time that I would wish that my mother had had, but it was amazing time. It was, in some ways, almost holy to have that time with her and to be able to take care of her. Again, nobody would have picked it, but I truck around in the rhetoric of the Gothic a lot, and there are often representations that are very othering of people who have memory loss or have people who are not well, and I didn't want that to be the case. And so that was something that I really wanted to write about. And to write about, one of the questions, how do you write about an experience of illness from an outside perspective when you've known somebody who's been in a similar circumstance, but it's fiction that is taking place around the same things? All of those questions about whose story is it, what's the perspective, what's the distance, while preserving some kind of, way to convey the respect and the love and the positivity feels like a stretch, but even in the midst of great grief, we now know that people have moments of happiness, that emotion's never just a monotone. And so it's life with an illness in the picture.
Yeah. Something else that we were talking about, particularly in the beginning of the book, where she's describing the protagonist's childhood in the 1970s. Maile and I are the same age, and so we were both children in the 1970s, and reading the kind of haunted, very isolated and alone childhood that this character has, it occurred to me that the 70s were maybe a very unusual time and place in human history, in the sense that it was very, very common for children to spend a lot of time completely alone, whereas previously maybe there were more people around, there were multi-generational households, mothers weren't working as much or working in the home, and then nowadays it's if you leave your children alone, you can get them taken away by the state. It's not acceptable. But there was this period where it was very ordinary for children to be left alone for long periods of time, and also unsupervised, watching the most, we were talking about this, the most insanely inappropriate TV, and reading crazily scary books. You mentioned the trilogy of terror as one that particularly stuck in your mind. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that particular moment of being a child and how it, obviously, you just chose to write about it.
There was a strong sort of ethos of, if you get hurt, rub some dirt in it, walk it off, tough it out, you'll be okay. I can remember walking home, sometimes my sister and I, sometimes, like the years are sort of a, stepbrother, stepsister, and I, like, kind of rattling around in the house. It was a pretty big house. And it was normal. It was not by any means unusual. And just the memory of walking home through the rain in Washington, it's extraordinary. You just wouldn't see it today, I don't think. I've heard it described as a free-range childhood era, where you'd leave the house, and I talk about this sometimes with friends who are, around my age, where in the summertime you might leave the house after breakfast and your parents wouldn't see you again until 10 a.m. Do you guys remember the 10 o'clock news It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? The public service announcements each night, because kids were just out doing things. It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are?
It is very strange. But a lot of the time, I mean, you're describing being also sometimes spending a lot of time inside the house and watching these. I mean, you know, one of the things that you have a note on sources at the back of this book, and one of the essays you mention, I looked it up because it sounded very interesting. It was called The Haunted Generation. And this is another aspect of that particular moment in time where there was a lot of technology, but it was really bad technology and made strange noises, and the visuals were kind of imperfect. A quote from this essay: "My 1970s childhood was imbued with an odd sense of melancholy and a vague, unsettling disquiet. There's something in the television images of that period that's just not right. It's kind of otherworldly. The fuzzy, grainy look of archive TV presentation is a major contributory factor to this sense of childhood disquiet. Everything was seen or heard through a slight hiss. The TV would go in and out of focus, and that added to it." And I was wondering if you could talk about, because you know what you're creating, as you heard, of course, in the passages that Maile read from the beginning of the book, is a sense of hauntedness, like that what emerged from this aloneness and reading these terribly inappropriate books was a sense of fear and hauntedness. And I was wondering if you could talk about how why that essay resonated so much for you.
It's a very particular kind of memory when you recall something about something that you saw at some point and you have a vague sense of it, and not even sometimes enough to look it up now that we have the internet. But in the past, you might come across something and then never find it again or forget about it for a long time. The fragility of things that existed maybe as individual things, the ephemera of magazines that you have to buy while it's on the newsstand, then it's gone, and then it's gone. There's no internet to look it up on. You know, just the ephemerality of all of those things is something that really struck me. I loved that essay so much for the mood that it conjured, and I think that I can't remember if it's in there or if it's elsewhere, the idea that when we have surpassed a technological limitation, it takes on a sort of patina of authenticity as though it's closer to what it's representing, that may have to do with its fragility, which is very strange and interesting. But if you see, I think we all feel it too, if you see something, look at this strange thing caught on video, but yet it's pristine with great production values, you automatically don't believe it. It automatically seems contrived, or it seems dishonest somehow. But if there's some noise in it, or if the quality is degraded, or if there's static around the edges, a hiss, there's a greater chance that it could be something real that you're looking at. There's a lived-in quality to some of those things. And now you can buy crackle to add the sound of crackle, like a vinyl sound, you know, to add if you're mixing music, or, you know, to put into a video, or you know, the filter that makes something look like it's being projected on film with nicks and hairs and things and blemishes. I think that's really interesting, and I'm sure you do it as a kid. I'm going to make a pirate map, and somebody's going to actually think it's really old, and you burn the edges, you know, to make it look old. Like, it just keeps getting sort of like pushed further and further out. You know, what counts as vintage, and what counts as nostalgia, and what counts as being compromised enough to feel fragile enough to be real.
Right. I mean, something else that we talked about, I mean, the book is set in two extremely different, physically different places that Maile, she grew up in Tacoma, Washington, this very rainy, dark, wet place, as you know, and now lives in Las Vegas. Maile teaches, as you heard, English at the University of Las Vegas, and the second half, or more than the second half of the novel, is set in Las Vegas in a very, very different climate. And so there's I was hoping you could talk about like how you decided to use these two very different physical atmospheres in your book, but also, I mean, this is another thing we talked about earlier. There turned out to be a very real reason for the fear that you felt as a child growing up in Tacoma, which first became widely public when Ted Bundy was caught, who went to high school, I think, like across the road from where you grew up. And just talk a little bit about what you were explaining to me about the lead situation.
I wondered for years what it was that created the sense of unease that was so normal in my childhood and in the house where I grew up, and just generally, but didn't have perspective enough to really know that at the time that it wasn't normal. And this is not to say that everybody who grew up, when and where I did feels this way, but there was something that, stepping back from it, Ted Bundy lived in the neighborhood, first on one side and then on another, and our house was sort of situated between a couple places that he lived that are written about in people who have written about his biographical details of his life. It was ever present. It was just ever present. The per capita number of serial killers I believe is not the highest in the world, but it felt like such a pervasive part. The Green River Killer. I remember going to Eastern Washington, some summer when we were off school, and there being, at the moment there's a strangler in Spokane, which was where my dad and stepmom were living. Like, that's normal. And just things like that. There was a serial killer in the tri-state area on the other side of the state. And this book came out, and I was like 5 days late on a hard deadline getting the manuscript to Grey Wolf, because the book Murderland was published, and I had to wait to read it before turning it in. And the Asarco smelter was part of the skyline in Tacoma. And the amount of lead poisoning that the smelter was responsible for, Carolyn Fraser's book writes about this really beautifully. It's astonishing, the amount of industrial pollution, the amount of lead poisoning. And that book just explained that mood to me better than anything ever has, that shadowed, pressured feeling, in a way that I can't even really describe it as anything but an oppressive mood that doesn't change the fact that, there were sunny days and we were kids and all of the normal things of life are there, but there's something almost tangible. And so in the book, you can see sort of, maps of the area of Washington where the plume from the smelter affected, and also where serial killers were active, and looking at some of the consequences of, lowered inhibitions and maybe higher, maybe sexualized violence. Like, there's just things that come together, not only in that part of the country, but my elementary school was in the path of the smelter. And I just wonder, is that why it felt the way that it felt? One example that I'll just give from her book was that after Ted Bundy, I think, if I'm remembering this rightly, she grew up on Mercer Island, which is a suburb of Seattle. And there's a moment in that book where she's writing about having been, I think, in high school, and Ted Bundy had been arrested, and people were maybe talking about near misses with him or near brushes or meeting him, or so-and-so almost went on a date with him, that kind of high school talk. And at the same time, a number of women's bodies had been found in a heavily wooded area, like kind of east of Seattle, decapitated. And I'm sorry for how, but this, right? And this was the news when I was a kid all the time, and it was just the news. And what really struck me and that I recognized was that it didn't seem to be that Ted Bundy was suspected of those murders. And that the suggestion that they wouldn't be related says a lot about the texture of the place and just the possibility for that kind of danger and unseen threat that you wouldn't think, oh, I wonder if it was the same guy. That part of that dimension of the world was big enough that it wouldn't occur to necessarily connect them, because there were things happening. And we were walking home from school. And how do you balance those things? Yeah.
I mean, just to be clear, this is not at all a book about serial killers.
I stay away from. I don't
Right.
watch the movies, and it's just not. I just don't go there. It just doesn't. To me,
Yeah.
it's not. I understand the many reasons why that aspect of human behavior and psychology is fascinating. Though I did watch Mindhunter, but as a general rule, I lean away from that. But this book was different, and there are large sections that were difficult to read because of what's being written about. But I thought that she found a really beautiful balance between writing about, horrific ugliness and evil, along with explaining it in a way that requires the inclusion of what happened. Yeah.
I mean, it's what comes across very powerfully in this book is not any of the gruesome things that you have just described, but like the kind of feeling that one might get growing up in such a place before you knew what had happened, before any of this was out and concrete. So it's this sort of unnamed, not understood feeling of menace. The other difference is that, the fear of serial killers has to do with obviously going outside your house and, lurking strangers in the bushes or what have you. One of the things that is incredibly powerful about this book is it takes place almost entirely indoors and generates an incredibly powerful feeling of claustrophobia throughout the novel. It takes place almost always in Mandy's house, first her childhood home in Washington. Mandy is the protagonist, and then in her grown-up townhouse in Las Vegas. And it has a very Gothic feeling, and Maile, as you might imagine, is very much a fan and very knowledgeable about the history of Gothic novels. And her first book, which I also encourage you to read, it's also superb, called Your Presence is Requested at Suvanto. It also deals with themes of sort of and the feeling of claustrophobia and isolation and being inside a building. That is less of a feeling of trappedness. I was wondering if you could talk about how, we should probably go to audience questions in a couple minutes, but talk about how the classic Gothic novels have influenced your work, and how is it different writing a Gothic novel, if you would call it that, at this particular moment, historical moment, as opposed to the history that you're very familiar with?
I have thoughts about that. To be clear, Tacoma is intensely beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. It's a beautiful Pacific Northwest port city. If you look on Instagram, there are whole accounts dedicated to beautiful photos of Tacoma, a working port. It's just a beautiful area, and so that combination of a beautiful landscape and a certain feeling. That's kind of a classic Gothic setup as well. That there would be some place, although it's not remote. The classic move, in many Gothic novels would be that it's someplace remote. But to write a Gothic novel now, I think differs. So a Gothic heroine often finds herself in classic Gothic tales in a position where it's by doing the right thing that she becomes more and more entrenched in a bad situation. That she keeps her promise, or she takes care of someone, or she stays with someone, or she moves in with an uncle after being orphaned because that's what her father has asked her to do to heal a rift in the family. Or she travels with, there are often these tropes of keeping a promise, of doing one's duty, that get the heroine more and more and more ensnared. By being a good person, she's sort of feeding the trap or staying in the trap. And that was really compelling to me, thinking about, the presence of especially young women or girls in a Gothic situation, the architecture of it, the power structures of it, the decisions being made, the fact that one isn't legally independent because you're a child or for whatever reason, or because you're married, prior to a certain point, that all of the structures of law, of medicine, of expectation, of tradition are built in a way that you're not getting out of. And so that was one core Gothic principle that I took with me. But something that's been in my mind for many years now is, what would a Gothic story look like if it didn't depend on othering someone and making someone's perspective unavailable, so unavailable that it's unreadable, and that they are, in some sense, a mystery or an unknown. There are lots of Gothic works that depend on making somebody strange or estranged enough to carry menace just by their very presence. What would Gothic look like if it didn't do that? That was something that I really wanted to work on and to find out about. And so some of that is the house. Some of that is the fact that it can't be attributed to anything, that there aren't rules, that there isn't a presence. Even in a story in which a ghost or a demon, or even if there is a paranormal or a supernatural element, many stories kind of hinge on them not being sympathetic when you get down to it. That the power comes from repression. And I wanted to work with that. What would it look like if it wasn't that, if nobody was really the villain? People act villainous in the novel, and maybe there is a villain or two, but not in the classic sense. I don't think there isn't that kind of presence, that kind of unknown center of evil or of malice.
That is so revelatory to me, having read the book, and I hope that conveys to you how extremely subtle and insidious the menace is in this book. It's not at all a kind of I just hope I didn't mislead by asking you about serial killers. But there's a couple of questions here from the audience about process. One about if you could talk about how you wrote it, and another one asking about the editing of it. You mentioned before this that it was originally twice as long, and how did that all work?
It was so long that... thank you, Ethan Nozowski, for helping, my editor at Grable, for helping me trim this in the right places to make it a narrative with movement. Writing about memory with a kind of interwoven quality with the present was something I found really hard to do in a way that kept moving forward and that wasn't strictly linear. I just couldn't really find the places to cut to make, or how to organize time, and Ethan helped so much with that, for sure. And I don't think I would recommend anything about my process to anybody. I write by hand. I write longhand, which makes it really hard to find things later to transcribe them when I'm typing them in. Sort of like we were talking about earlier about how like you see something and then you never see it again. And there were times when I was like, I know I wrote a chapter about this or that, and then maybe finding it by accident or never finding it or maybe misremembering or meaning to have, like it kind of mimicked the final product that way. I think that with certain kinds of writing about ambiguity, my suggestion is to overwrite and remove. It's often possible to feel the presence of a longer work in what remains. The trick is which parts to leave and the difference between ambiguity and vagueness is a kind of like good yardstick to use when figuring out what to cut. But to overwrite and then to remove, you can feel the echo of what used to be there.
Can you say why you write in longhand? That's obviously very unusual now.
It just looks too close to being done when it's on a screen. I find it very hard to edit something because it looks perfectly finished, you know? But when it's on paper, it's clearly not a good draft. It's clearly messy. It's clearly in pieces. And it just feels like something that's in process. And so for me, I also work in a pretty patchwork way. So there might be things on the same page that are not from the same moment or even in the same project. And that kind of goes away if I were writing on a computer. Also, you have to be at a computer, have a computer with you. So nonfiction or academic writing, that I can compose with a keyboard, but I need the pen and the paper.
There are two interestingly similar questions that I have here. One, both asking about writing a novel in which you begin with the protagonist as a child and then she becomes an adult. One asks, when you have that set up, what do you keep and what do you change as the character matures? The other person asks, what was it like writing feelings of fear for a child, Mandy, as she becomes an adult? Is fear something that becomes more sophisticated? Does it never change? How do you tap into a childlike fear?
That's interesting. Don't work on it at night, late at night. I did that for years, and there were times when it really got under my skin, kind of stepping back towards, because I had bad dreams when I was a kid. And again, in the era of no supervision, nobody ever told me not to read certain things or not to watch certain things, which I loved, and I still have mixed feelings about, because I think overall it was for the best, but for long periods of time, I would wake up screaming, and then that would go away for a while, and then it would come back. And so I would be careful about really writing about fear and ambiguity in a way that's grounded, because to really write about it, you have to really go there. And you have to go further than what makes it on the page in terms of really sitting with the things that are unsettling. I think that things that are unsettling or scary that are written, when I was writing, the things that I was writing that were overtly scary maybe didn't make it into the book, or maybe didn't even make it off the notebook pages because they were scary. And when something is scary, it, written to be that way, there's a progression. It starts, it's eerie, it builds, it peaks, and then it goes away. But that lets you off the hook because there's movement and progression. The same way that seeing the monster in a scary movie sometimes can diffuse a lot of the tension. And it's what you don't see and can't identify, which can be hard to write about, and to keep it sustained. It requires being in that, for me, in that state of mind. Sorry, I went to some dark places in my mind, and the rest of the question.
Well, the sort of child-adult progression was the other half.
One of the things that you and I have been talking about is your article about aphantasia, and how that may affect biographical memory of one's own life. And I really, in thinking about what were my perceptions like when I was a kid, do I know what they were like? Am I an adult remembering it, childing it up, kind of? Or what? It's just so hard to know. It feels very elusive to me. And I think that it was attention to the language really ended up, for me, that was the solution, that the kind of nature of the observation in the language, rather than deciding on the character and then writing from there, so writing about what was around the character, and then letting that kind of establish what the character sounded like when she was paying attention to the world.
Yeah, I definitely noticed, having described your sentences, listening to you read the beginning of the book when Mandy is a child, the sentences are different from later on. Somebody asked, who's watching on live stream, and this is something I wanted to know too, because in your first novel, it's set in a Finnish hospital, and you did a great deal of research to get that atmosphere and the specific world correct. And this question is asking about the research you did for this book, and I was also very interested because it sounds like you did a lot of reading as well as conjuring your own memories of your childhood.
A lot of reading from a lot of different sources, a lot of different kinds of sources. I read a lot of magazines and ephemera, now often available online, but sometimes not. Sometimes.
Can you say which ones?
Yeah, like Fate magazine and the Fortean Times, even Time Life books, Mysteries of the Unknown, lots of paperbacks about esoteric subjects, lots of kind of what would now be considered dated textbooks or handbooks on things like hypnosis, a lot of things that were in print, a lot of old research, old articles, things that wouldn't be considered current necessarily, which I actually also did for the other novel because I was looking at like medicine at the time. I really relied on print archival things, even when I couldn't get the actual things, scans on like Internet Archive and other places, looking at the actual, like what the pages actually looked like. I ordered lots of old Omni magazine issues. The quality of the paper is incredible. Like it's like looking at the pictures and looking at just how expensive the magazine looks and feels is in itself. It just, the sensory experience of dipping into esoteric or cosmic or metaphysical topics being written about in the 70s in ephemeral form, even the ones that are a little later, like the Time Life books, like the images, they're just so weirdly pleasing in every way, the way that they're laid out, the way the pages feel, all the way to other things that are sort of, more kind of like, mimeographed typescripts. It's something somebody really wanted to get out there on a subject that they feel really strongly about. So I read high, low, wide-ranging things without a plan, often. So reading for the things that caught my interest and then following my interest rather than going looking for something in particular. I kind of worked from both ends. Like I took what I found and then followed it rather than deciding what I was going to write about.
And then, as you'll see, if you read the book, you'll see that those physical objects, the magazines, the books, are very much presences in the book themselves, not just background information. We have one more question. The description of the book mentions Mandy's ADHD. What did you want to get at or investigate with her mental state?
So I am not an expert on this, but I find it really fascinating that there are thousands of studies underway on ADHD and the brain, more than maybe there previously were. And the possibilities of human perception are, we we've been talking about this all day. Like, it's so hard to know what's going on in your own head, let alone the other people who are around you. What is perception like? What is the quality, the qualia of another person like? It's the more we hear, the more we know that we don't know how other people see things and process things. And so with the ADHD, I don't necessarily feel what I often hear said, that ADHD is a kind of superpower. But I do think that it's a difference that enables a different, and again, this is not a blanket statement because there are many types of ADHD and many people with different combinations of factors, but the ability for pattern recognition, I think, is in some ways what the book is about. And on a language level, that's what's happening in the book. That pattern recognition, that engagement when things hit a crisis point where it might be hard to engage, hard to initiate tasks until it's almost too late, and then to lock in with a sort of very cool-headedness is not necessarily the side of ADHD that people talk about, but if you ever need somebody to land the plane in an emergency, it might be the person with ADHD who might have trouble getting places on time, but who locks in a crisis under that kind of a pressure, right? There's good reason for that evolutionarily. We don't live in a society that's structured to sort of fit that. And the more we learn about ADHD, the more that difference offers some things that are, to me, really appealing insights into human experience. And also, it explained a lot about my life to myself, finding out, looking back with like a lens at what inattentive ADHD might look like in a reader, in a kid who reads books all of the time. And then also to have read your article and to think, well, what is reading like for somebody who might be aphantasic? I mean, that's really fascinating and exciting stuff that we really don't know that much about. And ADHD is a big part of that puzzle for me. Yeah. So I also wanted to write about, but how do you write about ADHD without it being so scattered that nobody else is going to want to read it? That was another thing Ethan helped with a lot.
Her editor.
Yeah.
I think we've run out of time, but thank you very much for coming. And Maile will be outside in the hallway signing books. Please buy this book and read it because it is just an incredible journey with so many different parts. I mean, we only just touched on a few of them. Thank you, Maile, very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.